Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar delivered by the Occupational Therapy Service on behalf of Abacus Specialist Bathroom Solutions. As you can obviously see, and as I'm sure you've already been introduced, this particular webinar is about assisted bathing following traumatic injury, assessment and clinical justification. What I want to achieve in the short time we have is to reflect on the challenge in balancing adaptations and rehabilitation. I'm going to cover that in a little more depth. I understand there's often a potential conflict there within occupational therapy recommendations that are provided for you. Discuss the importance of bathing as a meaningful occupation. Anyone who's seen our webinars before or seen us present for Abacus anywhere before understands that that's often an underpinning theme through everything we do just because of our experiences. But again, I'll cover that in a bit more depth. Consider the impact of bathing on pain, reflecting on the current evidence base. We're going to challenge some knowledge there a little and explore the impact of bathing adaptations on other users within the home. So why are we talking about bathing today? Well, clearly the first reason is because we're delivering this for Abacus, who specialise in assisted bathing. But actually, from an occupational therapy service perspective, our experience is that it's often an overlooked element within recommendations or within care planning and seen as I've put luxury in there in the presentation, but yes, either luxury or something that just isn't given the time that it necessarily should. And that comes down to what questions are asked about it. I'm going to cover the client-centered nature of it in a little bit more depth later, so I don't want to mix that up too much. But in our experience, it's of providing quality assurance on a number of reports, and we often feel like we're needing to challenge what it is that's been asked about bathing for someone who's had a traumatic injury. So, in the context of a traumatic injury, bathing becomes a complex intersection of physical, psychological, and environmental needs. Because so many things happen within the bath and the bath space, the bathroom space. The reason I've called that a complex intersection is that it isn't just about, or it shouldn't just be about that physical element of a wash. And we're going to cover that, like I say, in a bit more depth within the client-centeredness of it. But it covers mental health, the physical health. How does the environment support that? Is the environment itself disabling? And are we making that jump to showering before asking the right questions of the person? So the first thing for us to cover is I'm delivering this as an occupational therapist. Um, so therefore, meaningful occupation is going to be a core part of everything I do and talk about. So use that as a starting point. So bathing is a meaningful occupation. So bathing offers a rare moment of privacy, routine and ritual, and self-connection. After trauma, when so much control is lost, restoring autonomy in bathing, and I could have put in anything in there, anything else, can significantly impact mental health. I was talking here about giving some control back. So, for example, they're a young adult with a traumatic brain injury using a high-low bath to regain confidence in self-care, and an amputee who can finally bathe independently without hoisting trauma. And I could have just as easily put in there bathing with their child as a parent or anything else. We don't just enable function, we enable meaning. And a quote there from Wilcock, meaningful occupation is as important as medical recovery. So we're going to start to challenge a little bit about what a bathing assessment consists of. When somebody conducts a bathing assessment for you as a case manager, or if they're occupational therapists who work alongside case managers on this webinar, what are you providing and delivering for them? And ultimately maximizing the outcome for our clients. But some of the key topics we're going to also talk about are the adaptation versus rehabilitation element, bathing in pain, bathing in sleep, and how we manage somebody who might want to bathe but has, say, for example, seizure activity. So rehabilitation adaptation dilemma. The reason I've put this in is because obviously installing a specialist bath is an adaptation. Um, but I completely agree and understand that rehabilitation first is the best solution. So if somebody can continue to rehabilitate to the point where they're not needing adaptations or certainly significant, complex and high, what might be perceived as high cost adaptations, I get that. That's the way forward. But nor am I of the opinion that rehabilitation adaptations necessarily need to be mutually exclusive. I've put in here in this slide, there's often that perceived tension between support and rehabilitation and introducing assistive equipment or environmental adaptations. Clinicians, or in this instance, case managers, and the funders, so deputies, if the person has one, solicitors, for example, may worry that providing adaptations too early will reduce the client's motivation to recover, or indeed not be required once the person reaches their rehabilitative goals. This is all about return on investment and providing value for money. If you're interested, because this in this half hour or so that we have, this is kind of a whistle stop tour to get into the topic and to provide some, or hopefully to stimulate some reflection. We have a separate presentation just on determining return on return on investment, which we can, if you're interested, come to deliver to your teams, or if you think that's something you'd be interested in on a separate webinar, please just put it in the comments, and we'll know that for the next time. However, adaptive strategies can support rather than hinder rehabilitation, particularly when they're carefully timed and tailored. What I'm thinking about there in terms of the carefully timed and for the right person is there are some people who are going to continue to rehabilitate, absolutely, and it may not be the right time for them until there's been that plateau and we determine that actually the continued growth and rehabilitation of this person is now limited. But it could be that from a very early stage, certainly someone who's had a more significant traumatic injury and maybe is being hoisted and is needing postural supports, and is less likely to rehabilitate to the point of maybe being ambulant, or being independent. As occupational therapists, I think we started to move away from using the word independent in a way of describing what we do because it rules out those who are never going to be fully independent. And it is then more about maximizing dignity, engagement, and supporting the care teams. So it may well be for that person that in a very early stage, yes, we can recommend specialist bathing as a perceived significant adaptation, but actually that might support growth and support rehabilitation moving forward. So that's what I mean about the timing of it is us being able to challenge occupational therapists within their reports of is this the right time for this recommendation, or if there isn't really a question of the timing, have you clearly articulated your justification there well enough? So bathing in pain. Bathing for pain reduction is from what we see, whether it's within statutory services or the private sector, one of the most commonly recommended um, times where bathing would be recommended and approved because there's this perception that bathing supports the reduction of pain. So are you comfortable with that? Because whilst there is a growing body, there is a body of research that supports hydrotherapy and warm water immersion as a non-medicated method of pain management. They're in very specific conditions and with very specific needs. So there are quite prescribed criteria by which some of this research demonstrates that pain is reduced through bathing. There is absolutely no research evidence to back up standard domestic bathing and pain reduction. And yet, if we're doing work, I know this isn't part of this webinar particularly, but if we were doing work for a local authority, say, for example, or reviewing reports for local authority, they would often say that supporting the installation of a standard bath, maybe where someone's had a wet room or a level access shower before, is something that they'd most commonly approve because of their perceived idea of the evidence. That evidence does not exist. However, there is, like I say, a body of research supporting hydrotherapy and balneotherapy for pain reduction. They're in the references, and I'm going to talk a little about them now. But it would be interesting for you to explore that research yourself. We don't have time to do it on this webinar. Again, if pain and bathing is something you'd like explored in more depth in a separate webinar, please put that in the comments, or it's something that we can come and deliver as a lunch and learn for completely free to your teams with Abacus. But where there is some evidence around balneotherapy and hydrotherapy is around spinal injury, CRPS, polytrauma, and particularly neuropathic pain, and some level of musculoskeletal injury. So the key studies for us to look at there are the Coe et al. Of 2013, which is about warm water immersion to show the reduced nerve sensitivity, increased muscle relaxation and circulation in the study in 2008, balneotherapy and the impact on gait by Kolikoglu in 2009, and the big study here is the impact of spa therapy, which was called the NIAD project of 2003 in Italy. NIAD is, if I'm right, my research is right, is Latin word for water nymph, water fairy, which is why they used that for this project. On the back of that particular project, you can be prescribed spa treatment in Italy on their health service for pain reduction. However, like I say, there are specific conditions. They all involve spa therapies, so not within standard bathing. And some of them, like the Kolikoglu trial there, also involve particular minerals in the water. The reason I've put this in, though, is firstly to challenge our perception of evidence base. So we often, as occupational therapists, we'll say, yes, we're an evidence-based profession, but then I'll go and challenge occupational therapists to find, or do you know and understand that evidence base? And I get quite blank expressions, particularly when it comes to pain. It's one of those areas where there's this perception that it works. Is perception enough? Are different types of clinical reasoning enough for you? Or does it have to be more research-based, more evidence-based, more scientifically evidence-based with empirical data to provide that level of funding for this kind of adaptation? Now, interestingly, if somebody came to you and said, I'd like to reinstall a standard bath for your client who's had a traumatic orthopedic injury to help them reduce pain, the cost for that might not be that significant, and you might be inclined as the budget holder to say, yes, that's fine if you're telling me that that's going to help. The truth of the matter is, there's no evidence to say that that's going to help. If someone came to you and say, I'd like to install an Abacus specialist bath which has spa hydrotherapy built in, and it has a perceived significantly greater initial outlay, you might take a step back and think, okay, what's the evidence for this? Well, actually, there's more evidence for that than there is for the previous recommendation. So our challenge there is, what is our understanding of it? Ask as a case manager in the first instance, but also what is the occupational therapist's understanding of it? How is their evidence base being challenged to come up with the right solutions? And like I started to touch on there, does it really matter to you? It may not. I don't know. It'd be interesting in the comments to find out whether it does or not. Even just from my own, from an occupational therapist perspective, because there are other ways of providing clinical reasoning. There are different types of clinical reasoning. There are, in this instance, is experiential clinical reasoning enough? If you or I are feeling a bit sore, we've been at the gym, we've been for a long walk, we're just feeling a bit achy, we might go and have a bath. If we feel like it helps us, does it matter that we can't back that feeling up with research or not? I don't know, it'd be really interesting to get your feedback on that. Because rhetorically, standard bathing or any kind of bathing relieves muscle spasms. The increase in buoyancy helps to remove pressure from the joints for someone who's arthritic. Rhetorically, it increases flexibility by lowering muscle tone, helps us relax. Is it supported by research? No, not standard bathing. Like I say, specialist bathing with balneotherapy or spa therapy that Abacus can provide. There is, but does it matter that there isn't for the others? And balneotherapy and spa therapy, how can we use that research to justify the recommendation for standard domestic bathing, or in this instance, the installation of a more specialist adaptation? Hopefully, just some things to reflect on there. Bathing and sleep. Now, bathing and sleep is, I find, one of the most fascinating topics because it is significantly evidence-based. Now, I'm a parent of four children, and I completely understand that for my children, bathing has been an important part of their bedtime routine. But I've never really understood the science behind it. I thought it was always just around being clean, it them being supported by that routine, so they know it's bath time, it's supper time, it's read a book, and it's bedtime. But the science behind bathing and sleep has really opened my eyes from a clinical perspective about what more we could do for clients who maybe have some nocturnal needs, and particularly those with maybe a dementia or those who have a head injury and may become confused at night, or anything like that. Bathing could have a significant impact. The reason I've used this particular study is that it just encapsulates a number of other studies. So this research was conducted by the University of Texas in 2019, so it's quite current, quite contemporary and relevant. They looked at over 5,000 water-based passive body heat studies. So this is people being bathing and showering. And they said that those who bathed in certain conditions, so by bathed I mean submerged in water, had a significantly better quality sleep across the board. So whether it be sleep latency, sleep onset, REM, or all of the elements of sleep improved when the person bathed. And they said between 1 and 2 hours before sleep, I've put 90 minutes in there as that split between the two. At 40 to 42 degrees Celsius maximizes the outcomes, but that's a hot bath. That's hotter than you'd get in any kind of care environment, where there's or in an Abacus bath, where there's a thermostat limiting that temperature for obvious reasons. But what the research also says is that reducing that temperature doesn't change the outcome, it just reduces the effect of it slightly. So if you consider 37 to 38 degrees as probably a standard bathing temperature, this is still relevant. It just ever so slightly reduces the impact. And you've got to bathe for more than 10 minutes. The reason, this is the thing that I find fascinating, the reason that they said that that has a positive impact is because those conditions impact the circadian rhythm. So the circadian rhythm we're talking about is a sleep-wake cycle. So as we go through the day, the core body temperature lowers to induce sleep, as highlighted in Murphy's research that I've put in the references. So as we sleep, our core body temperature comes back to normal, and as the day goes on over the 24-hour period, or over our 12 or 20-hour period, the core body temperature lowers to the point where we become fatigued and we go to bed. It's why where if you've had a few nights where you've had no sleep, you start to feel cold, you start to feel like you've got a virus. Actually, you haven't got a virus. Your core body temperature is just dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping to force you at some point to go to bed and to sleep and catch up. We have a great night's sleep, we wake up and we think, oh, it must have been just fighting off a virus. Actually, you were just exhausted. And the hypothalamus, which is where the sleep wake cycle as a circadian rhythm comes from, it's where it's controlled. It's forcing us to sleep. If you've got someone with a traumatic brain injury where that part of the brain is damaged, this is a way of potentially inducing that cycle where it isn't being forced upon as well. It's really, really fascinating research. So what the bathing does in those conditions is it raises the core body temperature by enough so that the brain thinks it's being tricked. So when you get out of the bath, it rapidly tries to catch up with its core body temperature, and that rapid drop in core body temperature induces deep sleep. So it's about how quickly the core body temperature changes, and that's what has the impact. So there is some benefit from showering. I'm not pretending that there's not, and it says that in the research. But the best outcomes were those who bathed in as close to those conditions as possible. It's really fascinating. Bathing and mental health. Again, all of these things are are topics we have separate presentations on. What I'm trying to do provide to here is provide you with a snapshot. So if anything crops up in here that you think, actually, I'd love to know more about that, or I'd love to have a whole separate hour presentation on that, either with our team or as a separate webinar, please just pop it in the comments. Breathing and mental health. So the starting point for me here is, and we do start to get much more into the client-centered bathing of it, because if I asked you rhetorically, why do you bathe? And I've done asked this question in front of rooms of hundreds of people, they very rarely does somebody say, I get in the bath to have a wash. They have a wash when they're in there, but they tend to not get in there for that purpose. Getting washed is a byproduct of being in there. So if I go back to my own experience of having my children when they've been young, bath time for me, when they've been very little, I've been in the bath with them. That's been my time. It's been an important part of my role. Yes, I've had a wash. Yes, they've had a wash. But actually, when they've been very little and babies, it's been about bonding. It's that skin on skin. It's been a time for my wife to go and do something else, for her to not have to do something with the children if she's been with them all day and I've been at work. As they've got a little bit older, it's turned into playtime, and I've got into trouble for playing when I should be getting them ready for bed. Um, my wife might bathe for a completely different reason. For her, it's just she wants the children nowhere near the bathroom when she's in there. That's her time to completely relax, to reflect. She needs that for her mental health. Why do you bathe? Consider that, if nothing else, as part of this presentation. And then what would happen if you couldn't? So if I, as an occupational therapist, after you've had a traumatic injury, came and said, I'm sorry, we're going to have to take the bath out because you can't get in and out of it safely anymore, and I'm going to put a shower in. If that meant you couldn't bathe with your small child, if it meant you couldn't reflect or use bathing for your mental health, if it significantly changed your routine, how would that make you feel? And if you feel like that, or if you don't bathe primarily to have a wash, why do we often assume that that's what our clients are doing? Why does a bathing assessment then become about a shower where the person's going to have a wash? Is the person completing the assessment asking, how do you bathe? Or are they asking, why do you bathe? They are two very different questions, and they could come out with very different, lead to very different conclusions. They may not. But at least then the assessment is occupation focused and client centered. And you as the case manager can be assured that you're getting good value. I put reasons not to bathe in here because I think it's an important point to cover. We often have this conversation with occupational therapists who talk about, oh yeah, this person, or we see it in reports where the person says, this person can't bathe because, or they have this condition and therefore they must shower. I don't buy into that at all. I think that is a symptom of asking the how question rather than the why question, and us not understanding what the market now can provide for bathing. So, for example, I'm going to sort of touch on two um, typical reasons why we hear occupational therapists saying they've recommended showering rather than bathing. And the first one is epilepsy, or someone who has seizure activity following a traumatic brain injury. The Epilepsy Foundation in 2016, and it was on their website, said that the barrier to bathing for people with epilepsy has arisen from the complexities of the guidance around removing a person from a bath when they are having a seizure or supporting their airways to remain clear of the water. That makes absolute sense, doesn't it? You don't want someone having a seizure, submerged in water, and having to remove them from the water while they're having a seizure. There's a high risk of drowning or at least taking on water in that situation and aspirating. However, with something like the Gemini MX platform bath, we are adapting the environment to not have to remove the person from the water, but to remove the water from the person. So as you can see in the picture there, and there's a video clip of it later on in the presentation, this person is using, it's the old Gemini bath, the new Gemini MX is where you've seen the other images, but this is actually an epilepsy center, a day center that also has respite, who installed the Gemini baths after their young residents were saying that they were missing having a bath when they were there, and the only option to them was having a shower. So what the therapists in that environment did was just revise their risk assessment. They looked at a model of practice, which we're going to come on to slightly later, and thought, right, how do we remove some of these risks? And adapting the environment in their instance allowed them to reduce risk enough for their users, their clients, their residents to bathe despite the risk of seizure activity. And that's because quite simply, the adaptation meant that they could remove the water from the person while securing the person safely on that comfortable platform. The Gemini MX is even more comfortable with the new mattress that's on there. So the person could comfortably be supported on that platform whilst the water was removed from them until it was safe to then either continue that bath or to remove the person from the bath once their seizure activity had ended. So it's a really good example of using a proactive risk assessment to meet a meaningful need, a meaningful occupation. This isn't actually necessarily a need, it's a want and an expectation, as occupational therapists should also be covering in this sector, need, want, and expectation. And fetal incontinence is another one. It's very obvious that if somebody moves their bowels in bath water, the bath isn't going to want to be continued. But how do you then get that person clean? That person who's fetally incontinent traditionally, I think an occupational therapist or somebody else would recommend showering. But again, what if the water could be removed from the person and the shower head that's attached to the bath could then be used to continue to clean that person down before they were then removed from that bath. The Gemini MX platform allows water to be removed from the bather and be cleaned with the shower head. So it's just asking those critical questions for the occupational therapists on here, asking it of yourselves, and for the case managers who know the client, you've met them first, you understand them. Is if there's something on there like that you think actually they've already told me how much they enjoy bathing, or I'm not sure that this has been expressed in detail enough. Challenge the occupational therapist to articulate that in more depth. And now that you're aware of this as a product, put it to them. Would this solve that? And that leads nicely into communicating clinical reasoning and evidence base. So in the insurance sector, litigation insurance sector, funding depends on the strength of your or our clinical rationale, as it should everywhere. But even more so within this sector, we as occupational therapists, and certainly the occupational therapy service, we absolutely, as part of our QA process, make sure that every recommendation is accurately and clearly articulated with a robust evidence base. And that means that there's clear alignment to therapy goals. So there aren't just random recommendations that don't fit anywhere. If you set therapy goals, make sure that the recommendations align to them. but there is evidence-based justification, and you're saying what type of clinical reasoning and evidence base you're using. So if you are using bathing as a recommendation for pain reduction, clearly articulate it. Go to the point of saying that whilst there is no evidence for X, Y, and Z, from a scientific perspective, actually your experiential clinical reasoning suggests, and then make that recommendation, but at least then everybody knows exactly where they stand. Risk reduction documentation, so that has to be included, particularly for if you're recommending bathing for something like someone with a traumatic brain injury who's needing postural supports and may or may not have seizure activity. Explain how that risk is being reduced or managed in that circumstance, and with an anticipation of future needs. So future proofing is incredibly important. Again, separate presentation and webinar on future proofing and return on investment and how we communicate that and come up with the rationale for that. But all of those things should be included as communication of clinical reasoning and an evidence base. And often when I'm struggling a little when a case particularly is more complex, and I'm thinking, where do I start? Or how do I articulate my clinical reasoning? I'll revert back to a model of practice. Now, for this particular presentation, I've kind of put some images of the Kawa River model on there because I think it's a very good one for clients themselves to help articulate. So rather than us, particularly if the person's quite artistic or crafty, this is a really good one for them. Um, there are a vast number of different models, but this one I think because it's quite pictorial, the person themselves can get their head around it. Where the river is the person's life. So the image on the left there is kind of looking down on the river. The river is their life. The boulders within that river are their challenges. It's the things that is affecting the flow of the river. The environment on the outside is the thing that's sending the river down certain directions. So if we alter that environment, the flow of that river, that person's life changes. And the driftwood or the traits, the things that could be more transient but have an impact. The image on the right is a cut through to an intersection of that river. So this could be done in either way, with or without the client. And even if you're not going to use this in a pictorial way to articulate to the case manager, or if as the case manager you think actually the pictorial element of this isn't something that's going to help me, it's a good way of us of being able to in prose articulate clinical reasoning, particularly, like I say, when it's something more complex, when the person has a much more significant traumatic injury or multiple comorbidities. I just think it sometimes helps me reflect on where am I starting? What is this recommendation going to impact on? So if I'm recommending a specialist bath in this instance, on that first image, or even the second on the right, if I'm changing the banks of the river, how is that going to impact everything else? Because making a recommendation in one place affects something else. And again, that leads quite nicely into this isn't just an impact on the client, it's whoever else was in that household. So particularly if we're working with a young client, there could be an impact on other members of the household bathing, and how do they do that with a specialist bath? And it's absolutely possible, particularly if the person needs the new Gemini MX, which is the newer platform bath with the new mattress. That now, I think, with what Abacus have done to change that model, I think it's made it a much more multi-user household bath because it's comfortable for everyone. The platform just becomes the bottom of the bath for everybody else. But for the client, it becomes a changing table, it becomes a place to attach a postural support, it becomes all these other things. Whereas for everybody else, it's just a standard bath when it's at its lowest. So specialist bathing adaptations affect more than just the primary user. The positive impact would be that it reduces strain on informal carers. So people who are helping that person bathe, it can get the client up to A good carer height helps with moving and handling and all those sorts of elements. It goes back to improving family routines. It enables more natural interactions. So bathing a child rather than performing care. So supporting normal roles that the family would be having. The challenges are clearly the aesthetic disruption, so it does change how a bathroom looks, and there might be some other remedial work required. There could potentially be the loss of some shared facilities, but again, that comes back to what questions are being asked. So, how important and meaningful is bathing to the client and to the family? Um, and if the person has a smaller level of payout or and there is the potential to use or to apply for DFG as well as part of their adaptations. Don't forget that DFG can cover bathing, showering, or both. So there's the potential there to use both um, payout funding and DFG, depending on the limits, and I'm sure you'll know all about that. But DFG will cover bathing, showering, or both. So if you're needing shower in one space and bathroom in another, that's just something to consider there and something for the occupational therapist to consider. Clearly, if somebody hasn't had a more significant traumatic injury, the likelihood of you then using DFG is reduced. I understand. Just a case study there, as we start to come towards the end, is I've had a 32-year-old male with a C6 spinal injury. My caseload is predominantly neurology, so someone with a spinal or brain injury. Um, so this client had a C6 spinal injury. The main issue was high anxiety during showering. So this person already had a shower, and there were poor pain control. Interestingly, how pain came into this case study, and I've talked a lot about how whether evidence is and whether evidence isn't. I recommended assisted bathing with a height adjustable transfer bench, so like the Gemini that you're seeing there in the animation. You can see from that how when I talked about the water being removed from the person, you can see that quite nicely in that animation. So the bath lifts up to carer height, but also the sleeve around it brings the water up and down. So actually the platform itself doesn't move at all, and that's the new Gemini MX mattress cover on that platform. So I recommend an assisted bath with a height adjustable transfer bench. This person did have significant care needs as well. So actually being able to get my client to a good carer height was very important. It meant that more informal care was possible, but it also made it less risky for the formal carers who the client was employing. So therefore had a duty of care to manage that risk. The outcome was it reduced the care hours by 6 hours a week. The client started reporting feeling human again. Bathing was important to them prior to there'd been a previous occupational therapy assessment completed, and bathing had been treated as a transfer assessment. So how do you get in and out rather than as a meaningful occupation? And actually, he then hadn't had the opportunity to say how important bathing had been to him for his mental health and for his ability to relax. We also use some evidence base around bathing in pain as part of that justification, but I clearly articulated that that evidence was limited. The bath he did have was did have the spa features of it, so we were able to use some of those elements of evidence base as well, and that was approved and installed, thankfully for him. There was increased engagement in physio due to his improved rest. So this is where I talk about that link between adaptation and rehabilitation. So actually installing that adaptation for him improved his ability to engage in rehabilitation. So whilst he was never going to be independently ambulant, there were other elements of his rehabilitation that were positively impacted on by adaptation. So that's where right at the very beginning, when I talked briefly about the adaptation versus rehabilitation debate, where I don't think they're mutually exclusive always. So that's where I'm at with the content. I hope there's been enough in there to keep you interested and to just spark some sort of element of reflection. What else can Abacus do for you? So we can provide information or webinars on return on investment, anything else that I've talked about in here. And the Abacus Academy, if you search that up, or if as you've registered, I'm sure Abacus will send you the link for it. Abacus Academy is content we've written for clinicians. It's a website. So it covers lots of the topics that we already have covered here, either in blogs, articles, or bite-sized videos. We're currently going through the process of providing it with a significant update. So there's some information on there that's a little bit outdated, but new stuff will come regularly throughout the year. As you can see from the image there, Abacus have demonstration vehicles which have baths within it that you can have a look at, but probably more importantly, your clients can have a look at. So it's an accessible vehicle with ramped access. The client can get in, see the bath moving, get a feel for it, see whether it's something that they want to consider or not. And they with us delivering, provide lunch and learn sessions. So anything we've talked about today, we can talk about return on investment, sleep, pain, more in depth about client-centered bathing, or we can write something more bespoke to you. That's absolutely fine, and we can come and deliver that completely free to your teams. And Abacus also bring out a lovely lunch for you. So that's a bit of extra added value. That's just some screenshots of the Abacus Academy and where to find the link. But like I say, I'm sure the guys at Abacus will send that out for you as part of the follow-up to this. As a closing summary, specialist bathing isn't about luxury, it's about dignity, pain control, independence, participation. As occupational therapists and case managers, we have responsibility to balance cost with value and rehabilitation with realism. Thanks so much for your time today. Also, like to thank Abacus Specialist Baths for supporting client-centered care and for allowing us to deliver something that's just good content. It isn't actually about the bath itself. It's just good clinical CPD that I hope you found useful. And if there's anything else that you want us to deliver, please leave it in the comments. But for now, thank you very much.